April 1945. The island of Okinawa trembles under relentless bombardment. Every explosion tears through the earth, sending shockwaves that rattle the limestone caves where thousands of civilians have sought refuge. Among them is Sachiko, a 32-year-old schoolteacher, clutching her 7-year-old daughter Yuki against her chest. The darkness of the cave is absolute, broken only by the distant flashes of artillery fire that briefly illuminate faces frozen in terror. For weeks, Japanese military authorities had prepared the civilian population for this moment. In schools, in town halls, in hushed conversations between neighbors, a single message was repeated: the Americans are coming, and they are demons. They will torture, they will murder, they will desecrate everything sacred. Better death than capture. Better to leap from the cliffs into the sea than to face what awaits at the hands of the enemy. Sachiko had listened to these warnings with growing dread. She had seen the leaflets dropped from American planes, promising safety and humane treatment, but her commanding officers had denounced them as lies, cruel traps designed to lure the innocent to their doom. Now, as the thunder of battle draws closer, she must make an impossible choice. Should she trust the propaganda of her own government, or the uncertain promises of an enemy she has been taught to fear more than death itself? The cave offers no comfort. Families huddle together in the damp darkness, their supplies dwindling with each passing day. Rice runs low, water becomes precious, children cry from hunger, their voices echoing off stone walls that have become both shelter and prison. Outside, the Battle of Okinawa rages with unprecedented ferocity. American forces advance meter by meter against desperate Japanese resistance. The island, once a peaceful paradise of subtropical beauty, transforms into a landscape of devastation. Yuki tugs at her mother's sleeve, her small voice barely audible above the distant explosions. She asks when they can go home, when the noise will stop, when they can see the sun again. Sachiko has no answers. She strokes her daughter's hair and whispers reassurances she doesn't believe herself. In this moment, suspended between two terrors, the future has never seemed more uncertain. The psychological warfare is as brutal as the physical battle. Loudspeakers mounted on American tanks broadcast messages in Japanese, urging surrender and promising food, medical care, and safety. But these promises compete with the deeply ingrained beliefs that Sachiko and her fellow civilians have absorbed. The propaganda has done its work too well. The fear of the unknown enemy is so profound that many prefer to remain in the caves, even as starvation slowly claims lives. As night falls on another day of battle, Sachiko makes a decision. She will not choose death for herself or her daughter. Whatever awaits outside the cave, or whatever the Americans truly are, it cannot be worse than slowly dying in the darkness. But this decision brings no peace, only a different kind of terror. What will she find when she emerges? Will the promises of safety prove true, or will she lead her daughter into a nightmare worse than anything she can imagine? The cave system becomes a strange underworld community. Approximately 300 people shelter in these interconnected chambers, their lives governed by rationing, whispered conversations, and the constant awareness of death waiting outside. The social structure of peacetime Okinawa persists even here, with elders offering guidance, mothers caring for children, and a few remaining soldiers attempting to maintain order. But order is crumbling. Food supplies that were meant to last weeks have been exhausted in days. The freshwater spring that initially seemed like salvation has begun to run dry, forcing increasingly dangerous expeditions to the surface. Each trip risks encountering American patrols or being caught in crossfire. Several people who ventured out have not returned, their fates unknown and imagined in the darkest possible terms. Sachiko watches as the community slowly disintegrates. Arguments break out over food distribution. The elderly begin to refuse their shares, insisting the children need it more. Some speak openly of ending their lives before the Americans arrive. Others cling desperately to hope, believing that Japanese reinforcements will arrive, that the Americans will be driven back into the sea, that somehow this nightmare will end with their world restored. The physical environment of the cave mirrors the psychological state of its inhabitants. The limestone walls weep with moisture, creating a constant dripping sound that marks time with maddening regularity. The air grows thick and stale, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear and despair. Makeshift latrines become sources of disease. Children develop fevers. The elderly grow weak and confused. The boundary between life and death becomes increasingly thin. Yet even in this darkness, moments of humanity persist. Mothers sing lullabies to children who cannot sleep. Families share their last portions of rice with neighbors. An elderly man recites poetry from memory, transporting listeners briefly to a world of beauty and peace. These acts of compassion are small lights in the overwhelming darkness, reminders that the human spirit can endure even the most extreme circumstances. The war outside follows its own terrible logic. American forces employ flamethrowers to clear cave systems where Japanese soldiers have established defensive positions. The smell of burning and chemicals wafts into the civilian shelters. Grenades explode in nearby chambers. The distinction between military and civilian targets blurs in the chaos of close combat. Every explosion could be the last thing Sachiko and Yuki ever hear. On the 15th day in the cave, a new sound reaches them. Not the thunder of artillery or the staccato of machine guns, but human voices speaking incomprehensible words. American voices. The soldiers have reached their section of the cave system. Panic spreads like wildfire. Some families retreat deeper into the darkness. Others freeze, unable to move or think. Sachiko holds Yuki close, her heart pounding, waiting to discover whether the next moments will bring salvation or destruction. What happens next will determine not just their survival, but their entire understanding of the world, of humanity, of who is truly the enemy and who is the friend. The American voices grow louder, echoing through the stone passages. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness like searchlights, casting long shadows that dance on the cave walls. Sachiko can make out words now, though she doesn't understand their meaning. The tone is cautious but not aggressive. These are not the war cries she expected, not the voices of demons come to destroy. First Lieutenant James Morrison of the U.S. Marine Corps enters the chamber slowly, his rifle lowered but ready. He has been briefed on what to expect. Terrified civilians, possible suicide attacks, desperate Japanese soldiers using human shields. His flashlight sweeps across the cave, revealing scene after scene of suffering, emaciated faces, frightened children, elderly people too weak to stand. This is not an enemy combatant position. This is a humanitarian catastrophe. Morrison calls out in English, then in broken Japanese learned from a phrase card. Safe. Food. Doctor. The words hang in the air, met with silence and suspicious stares. He reaches into his pack and pulls out a chocolate bar, holds it up, breaks off a piece and eats it himself to show it's not poisoned. Then he places the rest on the ground and steps back, his hands raised to show he means no harm. No one moves. The gap between the American soldier and the Japanese civilians is not measured in meters, but in years of propaganda, centuries of cultural difference, and the immediate fear of the present moment. Sachiko watches this strange tableau unfold, her mind racing. The soldier does not look like a demon. He looks young, perhaps 25, with tired eyes that survey the cave with something that looks like concern rather than cruelty. It is Yuki who breaks the stalemate. Hunger overcomes fear. The 7-year-old slips from her mother's grasp and takes 3 tentative steps toward the chocolate. Morrison remains perfectly still, barely breathing, understanding that this moment could go either way. Yuki reaches out, snatches the chocolate, and retreats back to her mother's side. She takes a bite. Her eyes widen at the unfamiliar sweetness. She looks up at her mother with an expression that asks, if the enemy's food tastes like this, can they truly be demons? The spell is broken. Morrison signals to other soldiers waiting in the passage. They enter carrying boxes of supplies, canned food, water, medical kits, blankets. A Navy corpsman begins moving among the civilians, checking vital signs, offering water to the dehydrated, assessing who needs immediate medical evacuation. The Americans work with practiced efficiency, but also with unexpected gentleness. Sachiko watches in stunned silence as the reality before her eyes contradicts everything she has been taught. These Americans are not monsters. They are not torturers or murderers. They are young men, many barely older than boys, who seem genuinely disturbed by the suffering they witness. One soldier with red hair and freckles sits with an elderly woman, helping her drink water slowly so she doesn't become sick. Another shares photographs of his own family with a group of curious children. But trust cannot be rebuilt in moments when it has been destroyed over years. Many civilians remain deeply suspicious. Some refuse to eat the American food, convinced it is poisoned or that accepting it is a betrayal of Japan. Others believe this kindness is temporary, a trick to lower their guard before the real atrocities begin. The psychological wounds run deeper than any physical injury. Morrison approaches Sachiko, recognizing something in her bearing that suggests education and authority. Through a Japanese-American translator who has joined the group, he asks about conditions in the cave, about other survivors, about Japanese military positions. Sachiko faces another impossible choice. To provide information would be collaboration with the enemy. To refuse might endanger everyone in the cave. She chooses survival over ideology and begins to answer his questions. This conversation marks a turning point. The Americans learn of other cave systems filled with civilians, allowing them to adjust their tactics to minimize civilian casualties. Sachiko learns that the promises in the leaflets were true, that surrender does not mean death, but rather a chance to survive. The encounter transforms both parties, forcing them to see past propaganda to the shared humanity underneath. The evacuation of the cave takes 3 days. Marines and Navy corpsmen work around the clock to move civilians to safety, establishing a temporary camp in what remains of a school building. Medical tents are erected. Food distribution centers are organized. The Americans demonstrate a level of care and organization that contradicts every expectation Sachiko had formed. The most striking transformation occurs in the children. Within hours of receiving food and water, they begin to play again. American soldiers share candy and teach simple games. The sound of children's laughter returns to Okinawa for the first time in months, an almost surreal counterpoint to the ongoing battles still raging in other parts of the island. Yuki becomes fascinated by the American medic who treats a cut on her arm. He shows her his medical supplies, explains in simple gestures what each item does, and gives her a bandage with cartoon characters on it. The kindness is so genuine, so uncomplicated, that it begins to dissolve the fear that has defined her existence for weeks. She starts to understand, in the intuitive way children do, that the world is more complex than the simple categories of friend and enemy she was taught. But the transition is not smooth for everyone. Some elderly civilians cannot overcome their conditioning. They refuse American food and medicine, choosing to die rather than accept help from the enemy. Their deaths haunt Sachiko, making her wonder how many lives were lost not to violence, but to fear and misinformation. The psychological cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield, claiming victims through the power of belief alone. The American military government begins the enormous task of reconstruction. Civil affairs officers work with surviving Okinawan leaders to establish order, distribute supplies, and begin the process of rebuilding. Captain Robert Chen, a Chinese-American officer who speaks Japanese, becomes the liaison with the civilian population. He listens to their concerns, explains American policies, and works to bridge the vast cultural divide. Captain Chen recognizes that food is not enough. People need purpose, dignity, and hope. He organizes work programs, paying Okinawans to help with reconstruction efforts. The wages are modest but symbolically important, transforming refugees from passive recipients of charity into active participants in their own recovery. Sachiko volunteers as a translator and teacher, using her skills to help her community navigate this strange new reality. The simple act of sharing a meal becomes revolutionary. American soldiers and Okinawan civilians sit together, communicating through gestures and broken phrases, discovering common ground in their shared humanity. A Marine from Iowa shows photographs of his family farm to a farmer from Okinawa, and despite the language barrier, they understand each other perfectly. Both love the land, both worry about their families, both dream of peace. Sachiko finds herself in long conversations with Captain Chen, discussing not just practical matters, but deeper questions about the nature of war, propaganda, and reconciliation. Chen, who grew up facing discrimination in America, understands the complexity of identity and belonging. He tells her about Japanese-American soldiers who fought for the United States while their families were imprisoned in internment camps, demonstrating that loyalty and identity are far more nuanced than propaganda suggests. These conversations plant seeds of a different kind. Sachiko begins to imagine a future where this encounter between cultures might lead to something more than mere survival. Perhaps the devastation of war could become the foundation for a more peaceful world. Perhaps the false divisions between peoples could be replaced by recognition of shared values and common humanity. Summer arrives, bringing with it the first signs of recovery. The battle for Okinawa officially ends in June, though sporadic fighting continues for weeks. The island has been transformed into a landscape of ruins. 90% of buildings have been destroyed. The civilian death toll exceeds 100,000. The psychological trauma will take generations to heal. Yet amid this devastation, reconstruction begins. The American military establishes a comprehensive rebuilding program. Engineers survey the damage, prioritize critical infrastructure, and develop plans for systematic reconstruction. But the scale of destruction is overwhelming. Every road needs repair. Every bridge has been destroyed. The electrical grid is gone. Water systems are contaminated. Schools, hospitals, homes, temples, all reduced to rubble. Sachiko and her neighbors face the daunting task of rebuilding not just structures, but lives. The house where she raised Yuki is gone, reduced to scorched earth and scattered debris. Her school, where she taught for 10 years, exists only in memory. The community she knew has been shattered, with families scattered, killed, or traumatized beyond recognition. But humans are remarkably resilient. With American material support and Okinawan labor, reconstruction proceeds faster than anyone expected. Temporary shelters give way to more permanent structures, roads are cleared, fields are demined and prepared for planting. The military government provides tools, materials, and technical expertise, while Okinawans provide knowledge of local conditions and an intense desire to reclaim their homeland. Sachiko's role evolves from translator to community organizer. She works with American civil affairs officers and Okinawan leaders to coordinate reconstruction efforts, resolve disputes, and maintain morale. The work is exhausting and often frustrating, complicated by cultural misunderstandings, resource shortages, and the trauma that everyone carries. But progress is visible. Each week brings new accomplishments. A bridge rebuilt, a well restored, a school reopened. The relationship between occupiers and occupied remains complex. Some Okinawans deeply resent the American presence, seeing it as another form of colonization after centuries of being caught between Japanese and Chinese spheres of influence. Others are pragmatic, recognizing that American resources and organization are essential for survival and recovery. Still others, particularly younger people like Yuki, begin to see the Americans not as occupiers, but as partners in rebuilding. The American soldiers themselves are changed by the experience. Many arrived expecting to occupy a defeated enemy population. Instead, they find themselves working alongside people who are remarkably similar to their own families. The humanity they encounter forces them to question the simplistic narratives that justified the war. Letters home increasingly express admiration for Okinawan resilience and hope that this reconstruction might become a model for lasting peace. One particularly significant project involves rebuilding Sachiko's school. Captain Chen makes this a priority, understanding the symbolic importance of education in recovery. American engineers design the structure, Okinawan craftsmen provide traditional techniques, and the community contributes labor. When the school opens 6 months after the battle's end, it represents more than just a building. It represents a bridge between cultures, a commitment to the future, and proof that enemies can become partners. The physical reconstruction runs parallel to psychological healing. Support groups form, where civilians process their trauma through shared storytelling. Traditional Okinawan ceremonies are revived, helping people honor the dead and find meaning in survival. American military chaplains work alongside Buddhist priests, demonstrating that spiritual comfort transcends religious boundaries. The most transformative moment comes with the arrival of agricultural supplies. The American military government understands that food security is essential for long-term stability. They provide seeds, tools, fertilizer, and technical advice to help Okinawans restart agricultural production. For a population that has survived on military rations and emergency supplies, the ability to grow their own food represents dignity, self-sufficiency, and hope. Sachiko receives a packet of vegetable seeds from Captain Chen. The gesture is simple but profound. These seeds represent faith in the future, a belief that life will continue, that the devastated earth can bloom again. She takes Yuki to the plot of land where their house once stood, and together they begin to prepare the soil. The act of planting becomes ritual. Mother and daughter work side by side, clearing debris, turning earth, creating rows for seeds. Yuki asks questions about each vegetable, about how long until they can harvest, about whether the garden will look like the one they had before the war. Sachiko answers as honestly as she can. Some things will be the same, but much will be different. The garden, like their lives, will be something new growing from the ruins of the old. Other families join them. What begins as individual plots becomes a community garden. Neighbors who barely spoke before the war now work together, sharing tools, advice, and the simple companionship of shared purpose. American agricultural advisors visit regularly, offering expertise on crop rotation, pest management, and irrigation. The garden becomes a living symbol of cooperation between former enemies. The first shoots appear within weeks. Tender green leaves pushing through dark soil represent more than just vegetables. They represent life's determination to persist, to grow, to transform devastation into abundance. Yuki visits the garden every morning, measuring the growth, talking to the plants, imagining the harvest. Her excitement is infectious, spreading hope to adults who had forgotten how to dream. As crops mature, the community organizes a harvest festival, blending Okinawan traditions with American contributions. The celebration includes traditional music and dance, American military bands, shared meals featuring both cultures, cuisines, and speeches about cooperation and peace. Captain Chen speaks about the garden as a metaphor for their shared future. With proper care, attention, and cooperation, anything can grow and flourish. Sachiko is asked to speak as well. She stands before the assembled crowd, Okinawan civilians, American soldiers, Japanese-American translators, and military government officials, and shares her journey from fear in the caves to hope in the garden. She speaks of the chocolate bar that began to change her daughter's understanding, the compassion that rebuilt trust, and the seeds that represent their shared future. Her words resonate because they are authentic. She doesn't pretend the transition was easy or that all wounds have healed. She acknowledges the pain, the loss, the continuing trauma, but she also testifies to the possibility of transformation, of enemies becoming friends, of devastation becoming the foundation for something new and better. The harvest itself exceeds expectations. The vegetables are abundant, healthy, and delicious. Families who planted together now harvest together, filling baskets with produce that will supplement their diets and reduce dependence on military rations. Some surplus is sold at newly reopened markets, providing income and strengthening the local economy. The garden proves that with proper support and determined effort, recovery is possible. But the most important harvest is not measured in vegetables. It is measured in changed relationships, transformed perspectives, and new possibilities. Yuki, who once cowered in darkness from the demon Americans, now plays freely with American soldiers. Children who have arrived as military families settle into longer-term occupation. Her generation, raised in the aftermath of war, will have opportunities that their parents never imagined. Years pass. Okinawa transforms from a battlefield into a strategic American base, but also into a thriving community where cultures blend in unprecedented ways. The reconstruction continues, accelerating as the Cold War makes Okinawa essential to American Pacific strategy. Infrastructure improves beyond pre-war conditions. Schools proliferate, healthcare expands, the economy diversifies. Sachiko watches her daughter grow into a young woman shaped by unique experiences. Yuki is fluent in both Japanese and English, comfortable in both cultures, embodying the possibility of cross-cultural understanding. She attends university in Tokyo, studying international relations, determined to prevent future wars through diplomacy and mutual understanding. Her generation of Okinawans will become bridge builders, translating between Japan and America, Asia and the West. The relationship between Okinawa and America remains complex and sometimes contentious. The American military presence brings economic benefits, but also tensions. Questions of sovereignty, identity, and justice persist. Not all wounds heal. Not all grievances are resolved. The reconstruction, while impressive, cannot erase the horror of what occurred or fully compensate for what was lost. Yet something remarkable has emerged from the devastation. The encounter between enemies in the darkness of the caves, the sharing of chocolate, the planting of seeds, these simple acts of humanity created foundations for lasting change. They proved that propaganda can be overcome, that fear can transform into trust, and that former enemies can become partners in building peace. Captain Chen, now retired as a colonel, returns to Okinawa decades later as a civilian advocate for Japanese-American friendship. He visits the school he helped rebuild, now a thriving institution educating hundreds of students. He walks through the community garden, now expanded into a public park where children play and families picnic. He meets with Yuki, now a respected diplomat working on international peace initiatives. They discuss the lessons of Okinawa's transformation. Chen reflects that the key was seeing past categories to recognize shared humanity. The Americans who landed on Okinawa were taught to see enemies. Instead, they found suffering people who needed help. The Okinawans who hid in caves were taught to fear demons. Instead, they encountered compassionate individuals offering assistance. Both sides had to overcome years of conditioning to recognize the truth before their eyes. Yuki shares her perspective as someone who lived through the transformation as a child. She remembers the fear in the caves, but she also remembers the chocolate, the kindness of medics, and the excitement of planting seeds with her mother. These memories taught her that change is possible, that humans can choose compassion over hatred, cooperation over conflict. This understanding has guided her entire career in diplomacy. The conversation turns to contemporary challenges. The world remains dangerous, divided by ideology, religion, and nationalism. Wars continue. Propaganda flourishes. Fear drives policy. The lessons of Okinawa, that enemies can become friends, that reconstruction requires cooperation, that humanity transcends artificial divisions, seem as relevant and as ignored as ever. But Chen and Yuki remain hopeful. They point to the children playing in the park, descendants of both American occupiers and Okinawan civilians, growing up together without the prejudices of the past. They discuss programs that bring young people from different cultures together, fostering understanding before conflicts arise. They work to ensure that the history of Okinawa's transformation is taught accurately, neither glorifying war nor ignoring the possibility of reconciliation. Sachiko, now elderly, joins them in the park. She moves slowly, her body bearing the accumulated weight of years and hardship, but her mind remains sharp and her spirit remains resilient. She reflects on the journey from the darkness of the cave to the light of this beautiful afternoon. She mourns what was lost, but celebrates what was built. She speaks of the garden as her lasting legacy, not just the physical garden, though it continues to thrive, but the metaphorical garden of peace and understanding. The seeds planted in that first desperate year after the war have grown into something far larger than vegetables. They have grown into friendships, partnerships, and a commitment to ensuring that future generations never experience the horror that her generation endured. As the sun sets over Okinawa, casting golden light across the rebuilt landscape, Sachiko offers a final reflection. War reveals the worst of humanity, hatred, cruelty, propaganda, and violence. But the aftermath of war can reveal the best: compassion, cooperation, resilience, and hope. The choice between these possibilities belongs to each generation. The seeds are always available. The question is whether we have the courage to plant them. The story of Okinawa is not a simple tale of American benevolence or Japanese victimhood. It is a complex narrative of how humans navigate the aftermath of terrible violence, how trust can be rebuilt from ruins, and how simple acts of kindness can transform relationships between enemies. The chocolate bar, the garden seeds, the rebuilt school. These are symbols of a larger truth, that humanity's capacity for destruction is matched by its capacity for renewal. Yuki looks out at the park, at the children playing, at the monuments remembering the dead, at the life flourishing where death once reigned. She understands that peace is not a permanent achievement, but an ongoing practice. Each generation must choose us again and again, whether to nurture the seeds of understanding or allow the weeds of hatred to take root. Her generation received seeds planted by their parents, courage. Now they must plant seeds for generations to come. The future remains uncertain, challenges persist. But as long as people remember the lessons of Okinawa, that enemies can become friends, that compassion can overcome fear, that devastation can become the foundation for renewal, there is hope. The garden will continue to grow, season after season, as long as someone tends it with care, patience, and love. This is the legacy of those dark days in the caves, of the encounter between Sachiko and Lieutenant Morrison, of the first tentative steps toward trust. This is the promise that from the worst of humanity can grow the best, if we have the courage to plant the seeds and nurture what grows. This is Okinawa's gift to the world, proof that even in the aftermath of unspeakable horror, hope can take root and flourish.